From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
There's this kind of division that a lot of the historians writing about the 20s knows between, so to speak, the city and the country. That the urban and rural divide between cultural sensibilities. And this is something that stayed with us, I think, ever since. The revolution in manners and morals was not happening in the countryside.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Bill McClay, author of the book Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. He's also Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization at Hillsdale College. We talk in depth with Dr. McClay about one specific chapter from Land of Hope on today's show. Dr. McClay, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, Scott, it's always great to be with you.
We are taking this opportunity to get a little small inside your book, Land of Hope, and focus on a particular chapter. And we're talking about from boom to bust. The 20s into the Great Depression, that era of American history. This period following the First World War is synonymous with Warren G. Harding's now malign campaign slogan of return to normalcy. As you note in Land of Hope, there was a reason, though, the American populace found this sentiment so attractive. Why is that, and how does it set up this period?
Well, for one thing, the colossal ambitions of Woodrow Wilson, who already had done a great deal to change the structure of American government in his time in office, and that had involved Americans in the worst war in human history to that point. That alone would have been enough to make people long for a more normal form of existence. But there's much more. The economy was in a tailspin. There was a sharp recession after the war. The returning soldiers found themselves unable to find work. In urban areas that like Tulsa and Chicago and many, many others saw urban riots based around racial tensions. So there was a influenza epidemic, which a lot of people had forgotten about until recently, that killed an astonishing number of Americans and was a worldwide epidemic that almost certainly was brought on by the war indirectly by the transposition of people and the pathogens that they carried with them around the world. So the Spanish flu was something else that people thought normalcy after having the experience of it. And the Wilson administration which had been very aggressive in its use of propaganda to persuade Americans to support the war effort, had a disinclination to protect civil liberties. And Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, was especially concerned about foreign extremists, dissidents, and some of whom were genuinely dangerous. And this is the time of the Communist Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. So the idea that democracies might be threatened, might be overthrown by insurrectionists and the like was very much in the air. So, and yet the Red Scare of those years was carried to extremes because of the Palmer raids and the like. So people were very much ready for a change. And one thing I want to point out that's often fails to be mentioned in history textbooks is that Harding was the first president to be elected with more than 60% of the popular vote. The first. And there are not many that have been. So something was going on. He's generally dismissed and made fun of, as you said in your question. He made fun of for this not nostrums but normalcy. That was his saying. But, well, Wilson was nothing if not a man of nostrums. And to get back to a normal way of life, a normal economy, that making the world safe for enterprise rather than democracy in the Wilsonian sense, that seemed like a very good prospect to most Americans.
You note in Land of Hope that some of the same techniques that were used in propaganda for support of the First World War were repurposed in the 1920s for advertising during peacetime and this making America safe for enterprise. What effects did that have on the economic prosperity of the period, and how did Harding achieve that goal?
Well, this is really over the period of the 20s. Generally, is a time of enormous prosperity with tremendous growth in the consumer end of the economy. That the productivity of American industry was astonishing. The American economy was half of the world's economy this time. It's just amazing how economically dominant the country was. And a lot of that economic activity was directed towards the production of goods that would be consumed by individuals and households. So, refrigerators and appliances and automobiles, maybe above all else, the automobiles being a great driver with all sorts of ripple effects in the economy. Yes, advertising was a way of stimulating demand, so of making people aware of products that they had not considered they might need or want, and making that need felt in the most powerful way possible.
Not just need or want, but can't live without.
Can't live without, yes. But hadn't heard of it yesterday, but now I can't live without it. So, yes, and really the growth of advertising in these years was just as impressive as the growth in the products that the advertising was meant to promote.
Dr. Bill McClay is with us. We talk about his chapter From Boom to Bust in his great book, Land of Hope. Frederick Lewis Allen once concluded the 1920s experienced a revolution in manners and morals. But in the book, you provide a much more nuanced take that acknowledges some of these more libertine sensibilities, but also some of the socially conservative movements of this period. How would you define the 1920s culturally speaking?
I think it's better thought of as a period of division, culturally speaking, that the revolution of manners and morals is not a myth, but it really refers to a very small number of people who had access to the megaphones of culture, which even now, to have access to the megaphones of culture can give you ability to sort of create a sense of what's real. But at that time, people were very unsophisticated about media. And so, the kind of gargoyle journalism of the time with spectacular events and pseudo-events, Lindbergh's flight, enormously pumped up. And this occupies a lot of attention, a lot of column inches in the newspapers of the time, but doesn't necessarily reflect transformation in the way of life. Allen, you're referring to his book Only Yesterday, enormously influential and very entertaining book by an inveterate journalist. And he talks about how the automobile was turning into the house of prostitution on wheels. Well, I dare say that's an exaggeration. And Booth Tarkington, who's almost forgotten today. I mean, we think of F. Scott Fitzgerald, of The Great Gatsby, of Hemingway's early writings, and the sort of Lost Generation in Paris, and all that sort of concocted romance. But, you had writers like Booth Tarkington who wrote books, his book Alice Adams, almost completely forgotten today, was I believe it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it was a very, very popular, wide-selling book about a young girl who's not like Dreiser's sister Carrie, not this kind of ruthlessly ambitious woman who'll do whatever it takes to get to the top, but she's somebody who is an admirable character who comes from humble beginnings and really affirms the possibility of honorable upward mobility in American life. So I think now there's another side to this division, which is that you see the rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which comes back more as with an anti-immigrant element in it because the immigration, which had been going on at unprecedentedly high levels from the 1870s on. In the 1920s, it finally, that is slowed to a trickle after years, decades, 50 years, roughly speaking, of gushing immigration. It was transforming the life of American cities. So that's something else that those who thought too much immigration too fast. New York was a city, at one point, for 4 out of 5 New Yorkers were foreign born. That's pretty, even today we don't see those kinds of numbers. But so there was a time, an element in society said, no, we can't have any more of this. We've got to bring in immigration to a halt. And sometimes that took on ugly excesses of nativism, of xenophobia, anti-immigrant feeling that was racist in character. But it wasn't all like that. In any event, there's this kind of division that a lot of the historians writing about the 20s note between, so to speak, the city and the country, that the urban and rural divide between cultural sensibilities. And this is something that stayed with us, I think, ever since. But the revolution in manners and morals was not happening in the countryside. It was happening in the cities, and a few cities at that.
If we look more toward class, does the economic prosperity of the 1920s touch every level of American society? Is it a case of a rising tide lifting all boats?
I think that you can say that, yes. I think with one interesting exception that farmers, the agricultural economy, the collapse of commodity prices that had been going on through the 19th century continued. The period of what was called Coolidge prosperity lifted a lot of boats, maybe all boats, maybe most boats, but it did not lift the farmer's boat. And that played into, once the Great Depression came, the particularly dire state of the agricultural economy, which had already been developing even before the collapse of the stock market and the real beginning of a more general depression.
Talking with Dr. Bill McClay, his book Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. We're discussing the From Boom to Bust chapter covering much of the 1920s. One of the fascinating observations from Land of Hope is that the 1928 presidential election was the beginning of a political realignment that would culminate in FDR's New Deal coalition. What do you mean by that? How do the demographic trends contribute to that eventual conclusion?
Yeah, well, the 28 election was interesting because I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that Hoover's victory over Al Smith was almost entirely due to religion, to people voting by religious affiliation. That is, Hoover attracted the Protestant vote, and Al Smith, who was an Irish Catholic, attracted the Catholic vote, and a few other groups that tended to vote Democratic for a long time for a variety of reasons. That does begin with 28. You do see a coalescence of the urban working class, largely, although not entirely, Catholic, non-Protestant might be a better way to put it. And that sets the stage for Roosevelt in 1932 to really capture that group. And also the Southern Democrats, some Southerners were still Democrats from the post-Civil War era. The Solid South continued for quite a while longer. And And Roosevelt was a kind of a political genius in holding that together. I mean, the Democratic Party, the New Deal coalition, was made up of urban liberals, working class, not particularly liberal, but working class Catholics, and Southern Protestant farmers. I was going to say rednecks, but I don't know that I want to do that. But it was a most improbable group, and you do see ways in which, for example, on issues like civil rights, Roosevelt moved very slowly and carefully with those issues. Things that he's tasked for now, and I could talk about that quite a bit. That I think it's remarkable what he did achieve in this way, not so much what he could have achieved, one could imagine him achieving. Although I do want to mention on the subject of civil rights that the Republican Party in the 1920s was excellent on that Harding and Coolidge rescinded the racist policies that Woodrow Wilson had applied as a Southerner from Stanton, Virginia. He'd applied to a government hiring and to the military, civil service. And Coolidge spoke as a commencement speaker at Howard University, the leading historically black university in the country at the time. So really, the Democrats were the ones, and of course they were on the other side in the Civil War. So they were the ones who had something to prove when it came to race. The Republicans were very strong. I don't understand why the Republican Party doesn't reclaim that part of its legacy, but they don't. Anyway, so I think the 28 election, even though it seemed unpropitious for the Democrats at the time, it laid the groundwork for one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, presidential political party coalitions in American history. But if you're looking for consistency, ideological consistency in effective coalitions, you're looking in the wrong place. It was an odd collection of people that shared a similar enemy, and that was the main thing that held them together.
One final question on this from Boom to Bust chapter in Land of Hope from Dr. Bill McClay. We talked about the boom. We got to talk about the bust.
Yeah.
How did America go from reaching the heights of prosperity to an economic collapse in the span of less than a decade?
Well, the question you're really asking, I think, is what causes the Great Depression. And there's, I think, even now, not a clear consensus about that. I think there's some really strong disagreements. The standard explanation was, and I'll try to simplify it as much as I can, that there were imbalances in the world economy coming out of the First World War, that's kind of a big background structural matter, so that the recovery of the German economy was actually very important to the health of the American economy. But there also is the view that the American economy was too productive. It was overproduction and underconsumption. And that may sound funny because people think of the 20s as a time of a kind of raucous, riotous living based on Frederick Lewis Allen and these sort of gargoyle images of, bathtub gin and champagne showers and this sort of F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda dancing in the fountain at the Ritz Hotel in New York City. These kinds of images of the roaring 20s. But in fact, the argument that Keynesians make, and most, I think, liberals, Democrats would make a version of this argument, is that there was a maldistribution of resources. The rich were getting richer, others were not getting rich fast enough to be able to stimulate, to be able to provide sufficient demand in the economy to move goods, these giant inventories that we're building up. And when you have inventories build up and you're a businessman, what do? You lay people off. You stop producing. And so people started finding themselves unemployed. And without the resources to buy the goods that we were already overstocked and sitting in warehouses. And so another round of layoffs. So you get a spiral downward. It's a rather compelling explanation. But there's, I think, another explanation on offer that's pretty compelling too. And this involves the malfeasances of government, particularly the Federal Reserve Board, in contracting the money supply at the very moment that it should have been expanding it, and that these monetary decisions took what could have been an ordinary recession and prolonged it into a Great Depression. For it was the length of the Depression that made it great, not merely the severity of it. And it certainly, after the 1936 election and Roosevelt's contraction of spending, ironically led to what's sometimes called the Roosevelt Depression or the Roosevelt Recession, right after his winning one of the biggest electoral victories in American history. He overplayed his hand in a number of ways. So I think there's this sort of maldistribution of wealth explanation. There's this monetary mismanagement. There are other explanations. I think the world economy plays a role. It's a huge question. I think that how, and it's sort of troubling, because if we don't feel that we really know what caused it, what's to say it can't happen again? And I won't go on and on about the dire economic mistakes that have led us to where we are right now. But it would be awfully nice if we had more clarity about the past.
Dr. Bill McClay, Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization at Hillsdale College. We talk from his book, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. This the From Boom to Bust chapter. Dr. McClay, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Scott, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Up next, we talk with Glenn Ellmers, co-editor of the new book, Leisure with Dignity, Essays in Celebration of Charles R. Kesler. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined now by Glenn Ellmers. He is Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute, also a co-editor, along with Michael Anton, of the new book, Leisure with Dignity, Essays in Celebration of Charles R. Kesler. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us.
Delighted to be here, as always, Scott. Thank you.
Some of our audience will be familiar with Charles Kesler. He's been a previous guest here on the program, but others might be hearing a name for perhaps the first time. Tell us a bit about Charles Kesler and why a book like this was due.
Sure. So Charles is a professor at the Claremont McKenna College and also a senior fellow and board member at the Claremont Institute, but probably most famous for being the editor for the last 24 years now of the Claremont Review of Books, which is, we like to think, the premier conservative book review in the country. It aspires to be the right-wing alternative to the New York Review of Books and to exert the same influence, but I would say with more intellectual seriousness. Charles is also a very eminent scholar of the Federalist Papers. His annotation of the Federalist Papers is the best-selling edition in the country, and he's written very widely on that. He's a well-known commentator on public affairs and an essayist, author of multiple books, and a good friend of mine.
Charles is very influential or a very good influence on you, and of course many of the other authors in the book, who helped to shape his ideas and helped to shape his philosophy.
That's a great question. So Charles had three great influences. He is, as far as I know, the only person to have been personal friends with three of the most distinguished conservative figures of 20th century America. His first influence was with William F. Buckley. Charles was just a high school student in West Virginia when Bill Buckley came to give a speech at a nearby town. And this is a wonderful story. Charles arranged an interview on behalf of his high school newspaper and impressed Buckley so much as a young prodigy that Buckley ended up giving him a recommendation to his alma mater, Buckley's alma mater, Yale. And Charles said, "Mr. Buckley, thank you very much. Could you also give me a recommendation to Harvard?" Which Buckley did. And Charles went to Harvard and then fell in with his second great influence, Harvey C. Mansfield, who is still alive, has retired from Harvard just last year, I think, at the age of 90, but is still going strong. I saw Harvey a few months ago. He's working on another book, just came out with a book on Machiavelli. And so Mansfield, probably the most eminent conservative at Harvard in the last half century, I would say, was Charles's other great influence. And then the third is Harry Jaffa. Charles became acquainted with the work of Harry Jaffa, wrote a cover story for National Review on Jaffa's influence. Jaffa is, of course, the intellectual founder of the Claremont Institute. And then Charles, when he got his PhD at Harvard, came out to Claremont, first as a student and then as a colleague of Jaffa's. And they taught for many years together as colleagues in the political science department at Claremont until Jaffa died in 2016. So Charles knew three of these very eminent conservatives, which puts him in an interesting spot.
Talking with Glenn Ellmers, he's co-editor of the new book, Leisure with Dignity, Essays in Celebration of Charles R. Kesler. Charles is the author and editor of a number of notable books. What would be perhaps some of the biggest scholarly achievements of his writing and perhaps his contributions to the study of politics?
Sure. Well, he wrote his dissertation on Cicero and has still dabbled in Roman politics and the politics of the Roman Empire and Cicero's political thought. And Cicero is an underappreciated figure in the history of political philosophy, but an important one. But Charles, I think his main focus has been on American politics. He's written on the history and evolution of the American conservative movement. He and Buckley co-authored a book, an anthology of conservative thought called Keeping the Tablets, which is some time ago. I mentioned already that he is among the most distinguished living scholars of the Federalist Papers and has written very widely on that. But, other aspects of American conservatism, American politics. He wrote a book on Barack Obama, very interesting, insightful book examining Obama's philosophy to the degree that he has one. Called I Am the Change. Mm-hmm. Charles's most recent book is a collection of a whole variety of interesting essays he's written over the years, which he put together in a volume called The Crisis of the Two Constitutions. And then, but as I say, I think Charles's real strength and where he's been most prolific and prodigious has been as an essayist. He has an editor's note in every issue of the Claremont Review of Books, which is now, I think, is approaching its 100th issue under Charles's editorship, and often, in addition to his editor's note, writes a long-form essay on some topic. The most recent one, which I commend to the listeners, is Charles's very interesting analysis of national conservatism and Yoram Hazony and that whole phenomenon. As a scholar of American politics and as an essayist is where Charles shines most brightly.
Talking with Glenn Ellmers, the new book is Leisure with Dignity, Essays in Celebration of Charles R. Kesler. We've talked a bit about Charles Kesler, now a bit about the book. Would you say there's a centralizing theme of the essays that have been chosen for Leisure with Dignity?
Many, but not all of the essays, again, are on American politics, on the founding, some again, specifically on the Federalist, but not all. My own chapter is a little bit out of Charles's usual swim lane. I wrote on Shakespeare's King Lear, and Charles, although certainly familiar with Shakespeare, has not necessarily written that much on Shakespeare, but that's okay. These are essays by his students reflecting what we've learned and how we've gone off in our separate ways. But certainly, I would say a large plurality of the essays focus on American politics, which has always been Charles's strong point.
Tell people about some of the contributors who are able to lend a hand and lend some words to Leisure with Dignity, in addition to you, Glenn Ellmers, and Michael Anton. Who else can they read in this book?
Sure. So one is, and I did omit to mention one of Charles's other very important scholarly contributions, which has been on the progressive movement. Charles was one of the first to expose Woodrow Wilson for the truly nefarious character he is, and the deep and I would say baleful intellectual, philosophical, and political influence he exercised. Claremont has really been at the front for the last several decades of showing just how transformative the American progressive movement was in the early 20th century. And Charles played a big part in that, along with scholars like John Marini and others. And so on that topic, R.J. Pistrito, who is the dean of Hillsdale's graduate program, wrote a very good essay on progressivism that's in the Festschrift. Another contributor that Hillsdale audiences will certainly know is Matthew Spalding, Phil Munoz at Notre Dame, Brad Watson, I already mentioned. Tim Caspar works in the administration for Hillsdale and wrote a very good essay on Cicero, who we mentioned earlier. And then Murray Bissett, who's another good friend of ours and a rising scholar, wrote on Machiavelli. Anthony Peacock, I should omit Anthony, also contributed an essay on the Federalist Papers for the volume.
At the beginning of your introduction in Leisure with Dignity, you lay out a kind of genealogy for West Coast Straussians. And that's a term that the past, let's say, 8 years or so, people might be more familiar with as they read about politics in this country. Can you define that term for the audience, and how was Charles Kesler, so important in that sphere?
Great question. Bit of a complicated question. So yes. Leo Strauss was a very, very influential scholar of political philosophy in the 20th century. He fled Nazi Germany, taught for many years at the University of Chicago, although also spent a couple years in Claremont, teaching at Claremont McKenna College. And Strauss really revived, almost single-handedly, the serious study of political philosophy as a source of living wisdom. The left and most academics dismissed the great thinkers of the past as, dead white males who have nothing to teach us. And Strauss, in a way, revived, again, in a way that's hard for us to appreciate now, a half decade or more later, that Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and these others really have something to teach us because they have insights into permanent truths and permanent wisdom. And Strauss, again, enormously influential, had a great many students. One of them was Harry Jaffa, who launched what has come to be known as West Coast Straussianism, because he went out to California, again, taught for many years in Claremont and helped his students, created the Claremont Institute to carry on his legacy. And West Coast Straussianism, I would say, is the more political branch. The East Coast Straussians tend to be more focused on interpreting texts. The West Coast Straussians, of which Claremont is, I would say, the leading light and headquarters, so to speak, has focused on, has been more interested in American politics and in the connections between political philosophy and political practice. And Charles, again, has been an important figure in that, partly through his early work on celebrating and publicizing Harry Jaffa's work, and in his own work on American politics, which brings the lessons of political philosophy to bear on understanding American political institutions.
Glenn Ellmers, if there is one particular insight or one particular lesson that you think can be derived by reading Charles Kesler's work, what might that be? I know there's a whole book about essays and celebration, but if there's one particular lesson or insight, what might you cite?
I would say Charles, both in his writing and his personality, his conduct, his character, is an example of prudence and cheerful sobriety. Charles is a great bon vivant. He's always laughing and making jokes, but he's also a serious man. And he understands the importance of you might say, optimistic prudence. So, there's a lot of discussion now about what's going on in the American regime. Some of us are a little bit more cynical. Some of us are a little bit more optimistic. I would say Charles is a little bit more on the optimistic side, which reflects, again, his character. But there's also an important quality in that. He understands just how wise the founder's accomplishment was because of his great work in the Federalist Papers. And he still has a lot of faith in it, and rightly so. And so I would say Charles's prudential optimism is a great lesson and also a great inspiration to those of us who know him.
Glenn Ellmers, Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute and co-editor, along with Michael Anton, of the new book, Leisure with Dignity, Essays in Celebration of Charles R. Kesler. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you so much.
Up next, Dr. Dutton Kearney from Hillsdale's English Department returns. We'll continue our conversations on James Joyce, this time on Dubliners. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to follow us on X, formerly Twitter. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined by Dr. Dutton Kearney, Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Kearney, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Scott.
We continue our conversation today about the writer, author James Joyce. Last time we talked a bit about his biography, literary modernism. We talked today about Dubliners, this collection of short stories. Dubliners is a book that nearly was not printed. What's the backstory about its path to publication?
It was a bumpy path, to be sure. In 1905, he signs a contract for the book, and in 1914, it's published. So a bit of a gap. And what's interesting is it's published in 1914, right at the same time the Portrait of the Artist as a young man is serialized. That's also in 1914, and he writes a play called Exiles that's completed in 1915. It's not really published or performed. What happened is that there are two stories that one, the subject matter is just a little too racy for the publisher, and another one, the language is. And so they just said, and this happened all the time, especially in the Victorian era, can you change it? And Joyce crossed his arms and said, non serviam. He just will not do that. And so they said, well, we're not gonna publish this. And in fact, what happened is that they ended up destroying part of one manuscript because it's like we can't publish this. But Joyce had a history of having to deal with censorship. And as we'll talk about when we get to Ulysses, there's a famous American court case that really sets the trajectory for what is licit and illicit when it comes to censoring literature. So Joyce just held out and then was able to publish it with another publisher.
Got his way eventually.
That's true.
Dubliners is a collection of 15 short stories about Irish middle class in the very early 1900s. Why did Joyce use this particular approach to construct this book?
Joyce really embraced realism, and realism in a way that writers really haven't done before, maybe since. But his models are Balzac and Zola, who are realists, but their realism is kind of a catalog of everything that someone does. So if they go to the market, here's a list of all the items they bought. Here's how much each item cost, and then here's when they prepared the food and what ingredients they used, and maybe they forgot an ingredient that they couldn't find at the store. That it's just detail after detail after detail, and it's up to you as a reader to kind of put these things together. Mm-hmm. What Joyce does is that he takes this realism and says, well, wait, there's a literary dimension here. There's a journey here in all of our lives that everyone is participating in an epic or a comedy or a tragedy. And so what I'm going to do is to arrange the narrative in such a way that, I mean, there's a plasticity to the narrative. Mm-hmm. It's definitely not like Balzac or Zola, but that plasticity opens up to a particular way of viewing the world and interpreting one's life. And so he knows Dublin like the back of his hand, and he knows all the characters, he knows the places, people, history, and so that is where the locus of his for his fiction.
Joyce believed that Irish society was frozen in place, and its culture as well, for centuries by two large forces, Roman Catholic Church and England. In what ways do we see that philosophy reflected in the characters in Dubliners? You
see it everywhere. They move around like they're in a straitjacket. But around their legs too. They can't really breathe, as it were. And it's all the intermediary institutions that are problematic in Ireland for Joyce. You have the church, you have the family, you have politics, and then you have education, and all of these intermediary institutions that are designed to help us to learn about the world and then to thrive as human beings, they're all maybe corrupted, but definitely diseased. And so everything is beginning to ossify. In the very first story, the very first paragraph of Dubliners, the sisters, the narrator mentions there are three words that he has come across but doesn't really understand them. And that would be simony, paralysis, and this other word, gnomon. And what a gnomon is that you take a parallelogram and cut off one of the corners, so there's something missing there. Mm-hmm. And so you have someone who doesn't really understand words, but Joyce is using that symbolically. There's something missing, and what's missing is these institutions giving way to life, but instead they're leading to a paralysis.
Dr. Dutton Kearney with us. We talk about James Joyce and Dubliners. Another theme throughout this work is corruption or contamination, and that can also prevent progress. How does Joyce introduce those ideas into these stories?
Well, it depends on what the source of the corruption is. It seems that some of them have to do with the influence of England, that people who are Irish, like this one character, Little Chandler, wants to be British and wants to be a famous writer, but can't really do the work, and so he's stuck. You have an opening where the opening story where a priest has died, and so I mean that's about as obvious as Joyce gets when it comes to a symbol. That here you have the religious authority, and is just not present at all. But then you have people who are afraid to move out of their own. Out of their own paralysis, and so the corruption seems to be an inability to move forward. There's one story called Evelyn, and there's a girl who meets a man who wants to take her to Buenos Aires and marry her, and in the middle of poor, poverty-stricken Dublin, Buenos Aires is incredibly exotic. And then she gets to the bus station or the train station or moving toward the boat, I forget which, and she just freezes. So it seems to be that the people are frozen in place. That mm-hmm. there's not like this vivifying element to life for Joyce.
What is the function of children in these stories from Dubliner, and how do the children compare to the role of parents?
Well, what's really interesting is that Joyce has a unique approach to children. Keep in mind that the Romantics, who are maybe 1798 to about 1815, they worship childhood, that children have a vision of the world that we all ought to possess and imitate. By the time you get to the Victorians, children are seen and not heard. So for, and we make an exception, I think, for Dickens. But with Joyce, what he does is that he utilizes the inability of a child to understand everything about everything and presents a particular perspective. Because Dubliners is given to us with childhood, adolescence, and adult life. It's separated into different sections. And there are certain things that we understand as a grown-up that we wouldn't understand as a child. And so I think he uses that to kind of show that not only are there different locales and perspectives in Dublin, but there are also different ages. And even the very last story, someone has a realization, and he's one of the oldest and wisest people in the entire sequence of stories, and he's learning something for the first time.
Talking with Dr. Dutton Kearney about James Joyce and his work Dubliners. Another big theme in Dubliners is death. In fact, as you mentioned, we proceed chronologically through these stories, leading us to the inevitable conclusion. What does Joyce want to tell us about death?
I think that there's definitely the physical death, but there seems to be he's really concerned about a metaphysical death. So when at the beginning of the first story, the sisters, there's a priest who's died, and clearly that just shows the lack of the role of religion. And then the thing is that it seems that the priest's heart is given out. So you've got the seed of love and seed of religion, and these things just aren't there to guide the young boy. The very last story, the dead. What's really horrific about this story is that the main character realizes that the life he's living is a life that's somewhat dead, and so he realizes that someone sings a song, and his wife recalls that there was a young man who sang that for her, who wanted to go out with her and possibly marry her, and she had to go to the convent. And he sat out in the snow and sang and got sick and then died. And she was just really touched by the fact that here's someone who actually died for me. So you have that kind of a death that is a positive vision of death. Mm-hmm. And then you have her husband who says, I don't love her enough to die for her. And that realization is he's just stunned looking at the snow that falls on the living and the dead all across Dublin at the very last scene.
These characters that Joyce establishes in Dubliners, we will see some of these characters again, won't we? We do.
Ivy Day in the committee room, they're celebrating, everyone is canvassing for an election. I don't know if they're celebrating. It's a remembrance, it's Remembrance Day for Parnell, and Parnell was a man who pushed for Irish Home Rule. Got caught in an adulterous affair, and then was pretty much abandoned by his party, and so the ideas of home rule kind of died with him. And so you have people wearing ivy to commemorate him, but even that promise that Parnell gives of Irish home rule, that's faded and corrupted and dead as well. But some of the canvassers, we'll see them in the newspaper scene, or some of them will be at Patty Digman's funeral in Ulysses. But Joyce is, I think that his emphasis on realism kind of requires that sense of continuity between characters from book to book. And he'll do the same with Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man with Stephen Dedalus, who will appear in Ulysses. And Ulysses is, Miles Crawford, who's the editor of the newspaper, says to Stephen, who's writing this book about everybody, he says, put us all in there, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and Jakes McCarthy.
Dr. Dutton Kearney, Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College, as we talk James Joyce and Dubliners. Be back for more in our next installment. Dr. Kearney, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you very much for having me.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Bill McClay from Hillsdale's History Department, Glenn Ellmers, author of the new book Leisure with Dignity, and Dutton Kearney from Hillsdale's English Department. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. The assistant producer of the show is Sam Lair. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.